We're now going to open up for questions. Each of us judges will have 4 minutes, then our audience will have 4 minutes of questions. And to start off, Nick, why the Cold War of all topics? Why pick such a long stretch?
Well,
your thesis on?
I think I picked it because, well, as I said earlier in my speech, it's very recent. It's, well, relatively recent comparatively. It's a very long and conflict that took place over 50 years that has really changed and has a lot of effect on the world. And in my personal education, I didn't feel like I had learned a lot about it, and I was very interested. I'm very interested in history and wars and conflicts, and this one was very different from most. It was fought between primarily the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but there was no land war due to nuclear weapons, of course. It was fought through proxy wars, through espionage, through political statements, through denunciations, through embargoes. It's a very complex and sort of cloak and dagger conflict, and I haven't seen, and there isn't really many like it that have lasted so long, especially in the modern era, and that really piqued my interest.
Okay. Now, you talked about how the Cold War improved the economy of the United States, and you talked a lot about the overall changes to the U.S. economy, but you didn't talk much about the individual within the U.S. economy. So, sure, the nation did better, but what about the average American citizen? How did they fare?
Okay. Excuse me, sorry. Well, the average citizen, the average Joe, who was going out to get a job at this time, was probably a guy. Let's just say, because of the need for American products and trade goods throughout the world, as it was increasing, as the U.S. gained more allies that were perhaps not as powerful, but were still valuable allies that the U.S. could trade with in order to gain further economic growth. It required more factory workers, more administrative personnel. The already fast-growing and efficient industrial base and an infrastructural base the U.S. had needed workers. And as there were more and more people the U.S. could trade with and more goods the U.S. could produce and consume, that this only increased the quality of life also to your average citizen. And yeah.
Okay. Then last question for me before we move on. You talk about the civil rights movement and how vastly improved the African American situation was, but you also mentioned the Red Scare. So yes. Did we really improve societally, or did we just shift our issues from issues of race to political prejudices?
I think, the civil rights movement really took off kind of after the Red Scare. But of course, it was spurred on by the government amidst sort of the Red Scare in the 50s. And I understand that it does seem like that. It seemed that way, but in the Red Scare, there was a large and probably kind of legitimate concern that the Soviets were an actual threat. And also throughout the world at this time, there were many communist revolutions going on. The communist revolution in China, there was the Korean War, there was the Iron Curtain falling. And throughout all of these, the paranoia or the factors that sort of led the American public to believe that communism, the Soviet Union, was the enemy, or were actual physical events. And also there was actually a large amount of spying going on in the United States trying to steal U.S. military secrets. However, in terms of the segregation and racism in the South, the reason that those laws were kept in place was because of racial, basically racism. There was no significant threat. There was no overarching enemy, really. It was an old, basically a way for certainly. What I'm trying to say here is that the Red Scare had a legitimate concern. People were concerned and perhaps a little scared, and perhaps it did go out of hand to a certain extent. But there was a legitimate reason for that sort of government crackdown and government inspections to happen. However, in terms of the civil rights movement, there was no real good reason for it to occur or to perpetuate.
All right, so my first question is also going to be on society, and you mentioned that the Cold War, of course, you tie it very closely with the, if not necessarily the genesis, then the fulfillment of the civil rights movement. I'm curious, for another cultural phenomenon that occurred during the Cold War, the counterculture movement in the 60s, do you see the Cold War as being linked to that or the civil rights movement?
I think I do. In the Red Scare, there was a large growth of conservatism. And so that meant that most people that were raising children at that time were conservative, basically. And they had stricter, perhaps Christian values, and were perhaps stricter parents, especially in the baby boomer generation. So during the counterculture movement, the kids of these people that lived through the Red Scare and saw a rather large rise in conservatism, since there was a dramatic increase in conservatism, there was also in their children, a dramatic increase in sort of a rebellion in the youth from that sort of large, overarching, widely accepted doctrine and political belief. So basically, yes, I think that the counterculture movement was affected by the Cold War, but in the same way by the Red Scare, basically, by the parents of the youths, of the young people that took part and basically caused the counterculture movement, were sort of looking for a way to rebel against the cookie cutter sort of conservative lifestyle, home life of the 1950s and the Red Scare.
The next question is about interventionism. So you mentioned the Berlin Airlift several times and several of the wars. However, other forms of American interventionism during the Cold War, such as supporting dictatorships in Central America, in Africa, things, individuals or regimes that were probably pretty blatantly anti-democratic or totalitarian, however, they were anti-communist. The U.S. was pretty much amenable to supporting any and every sort of thing so long as it was not communist. So how do you square that, I guess, with your assertion that overall American interventionism was humanitarian in nature and was a good thing?
Well, I would say that American interventionism was, there were several different types of it. Humanitarian interventionism, I speak of more as giving aid to countries that are perhaps war-torn, like Germany after World War II and Japan after World War II, giving aid then. But I'd say that, sorry, can you repeat the question?
So basically, during the Cold War, America supported a lot of dictators and a lot of regimes that were brutal, that committed a lot of atrocities, so on and so forth, but they were anti-communist. That's basically the only thing they had going for them, and the U.S. was willing to support. Do you view that as being a positive, or how do you square that?
I view that sort of a lesser of two evils sort of situation, where these smaller dictators were easier to control than perhaps a communist state that was already very closely allied or perhaps influenced or controlled by the Soviet Union itself, which, well, as we see in the Korean War, the North Koreans were supplied heavily by the Chinese and the Soviet Union, and in Vietnam, the Northern Vietnamese were supplied very heavily by the Soviet Union. And I think that they would have, if we had not supported them, and I think a dictator who was anti-communist but willing to work with the U.S. was a lesser of two evil sort of situation. And once the communist threat would have been contained or dealt with, then the U.S. could have sort of started to lean towards implementing a more democratic situation, trying to help that coerce the country towards being more democratic and sort of pushing the dictator to the side, I think.
Next, Joe.
Nicholas, first of all, great job.
Thank you.
What a big topic. My question is, are we on the cusp of another Cold War with China? And if so, what do we learn from your presentation? Is it good or bad that we're on the cusp of another Cold War, or perhaps even in the middle of it? Are we in one? Is it good or bad? What do we do?
Well, I could go on for a while about that. Thank you for that question. I think that in terms of the Cold War that we've gone through already, and we've done that whole thing, I think we didn't really have a choice in whether or not we would get sort of involved. It was the position of taking the primary role against the Soviet Union was kind of pushed upon us after World War II. We were the most powerful nation in the Allies after, debatably, with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union wasn't with us anymore. So, and we already had, and we were having vastly large, different ideologies, and that were sort of not compatible with each other. And the Soviets at the time, though Stalin was very, he was a little crazy, but to be honest, he killed 50 million of his own people. It was a little crazy, but a very hostile sort of ideology to Western culture and to American allies at the time, which were Britain and France. I think that now, though there is a very large cultural difference between the United States and the West and China, I think that that China's ideology is not so vastly hostile to the United States. I think that there's more room for a cohesion there, and that I think there's more room for cohesion there, and that I always lose and forget what exactly the question is about. Could you say your question?
Yeah, so if we are or are getting into another Cold War with China,
Yes.
you said the first Cold War was good. Would another Cold War also be good for America?
I don't think another one would, because all of our industrial capability and industrial capability has moved to China. And we don't really produce anything anymore or export much. We import a lot and consume a lot, but that mostly comes from China and third world countries. So I think that would also, if we had a Cold War where there was vast trade embargoes, we'd kind of be left hanging. So I don't think another Cold War with with China another Cold War with China instead of Russia at this time would be the best.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations, you're almost there, just a little bit more.
Almost.
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 So, first, a clarification kind of question. For your main argument for your thesis, is it more along the lines of America profited at the end of the Cold War, or that America continues to this day to see profits from the Cold War?
It's that the profit from the Cold War, America continues to see profit from the Cold War. Well, I think that in terms of society, I think America still continues to see profits from the Cold War. Mm-hmm. In terms of interventionism, well, the whole situation in the Middle East hasn't exactly been, well, yes. So I think that I think America profited and does still profit from the Cold War, but in terms of interventionism, I think we have profited, and in terms of society, we still continue to profit.
Okay. My next question would be something along the lines of then, America today does have several major issues that we're currently grappling with, that, well, you'll be grappling with in college and whatnot as you get older, and we all will be in R. with the astronomical debt figures, a lot of the insane racial violence that seems to be going on back and forth, amongst other things. And this seems to stand in stark contrast to a lot of what you stated, where we've come out socially stronger and economically more powerful from the Cold War. So how do you reconcile the current state of American reality to what you have written?
Well, I didn't really look much into the current state of American reality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, just seeing things on the news, I suppose you could say that there is social strife, you could say. But in the Cold War, the U.S. changed actual laws that were, in place that discriminated against African Americans, and those were done away with in the Cold War, and the civil rights movement was spurred on sort of by the Cold War, and now it's more of a society itself, not much dealing with legislation that's in place, but society itself is trying to work itself out, and we're having issues there. And I think that's sort of the difference.
Okay. Last question here. You mentioned several times throughout your paper that the Cold War was something of a catalyst for the massive social changes where we desegregated the country, amongst other things. So while you were doing your research for it, what sort of resources did you come across to back up this idea?
Resources. I sent over several articles online. I think some of them are put in my bibliography. Several articles online posted by historians of note. I don't remember their names right now. But it's basically, that's where it came from.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Audience question?
Straight.
What would you say was the worst part of the Cold War for American society?
I think that the worst part was probably for society as a specifically? Or America? I think that that Americans did eventually get sort of weary after a while of war. There was sort of this sentiment after World War II that America was a little weary of war. That's why Korea may have been noticed as a forgotten sort of war. And Vietnam, there's already a large countercultural anti-war movement. I think that America became, society became very, I'm not saying being anti-war is a bad thing, because it's not, but that it became perhaps a little less patriotic, maybe, because of all the things we've been involved in, all the exhaustion that's been put on the populace. I think that due to that, and also just as sort of relating to what Sammy was saying about, or Mr. Arnie was saying about the sort of social issues we're having right now. I think that sort of led to a less cohesive society, a little bit, due to all of this.
This is a great accomplishment, Nick.
Thank you.
It takes me months to should be proud.
Oh, here it comes.
During your incredible months of exhaustive encyclopedic and systematic research and writing, after all that erudite scholarship focusing on the Cold War and how it affects America, and may I say you did a fantastic, intensive, and thorough job, only one singular question persists in my mind. What was the most stimulating, intriguing, and may I say even provocative piece of information you ascertained?
So what I'm getting here is that you're asking me, what's the most interesting thing I learned? Okay.
Very unique question, Dean.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I learned during my research is I looked up tax rates. Throughout the 20th century. And I noticed that during World War II, 1944, the income tax rate was 94%. Yeah, so that was, that's not air horn worthy, really. No, that's pretty bad. And yeah, I think now it's, what, 16%, something like that? Yeah. Yeah, also, yeah. But the average income tax rate was 94%. So that's pretty substantial. That's the most interesting thing I learned. Anything else?
All right. Thank you, Nick.